This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Glynn Tonsor, K-State livestock economist, begins today's show with a cattle market update where he discusses the market's pause, feedlot returns, meat demand, and what different generations see as important when purchasing protein. Continuing the show is K-State's Sarah Lancaster, Ron Graber, and Peter Tomlinson as they team up to talk about why atrazine should be used wisely and also share management practices and tips for producers to help keep atrazine in the intended fields. Sarah, Ron, and Peter conclude their conversation on using atrazine wisely to end the show. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update from K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. Glynn, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, and thanks for having me on, Shelby.
Glynn, what are we seeing for the cash cattle markets?
So this past week was a pause, slight pullback, I would say. There's a lot of watching of the broader macroeconomic environment, specifically what the Federal Reserve might do. And I'm going to break down the numbers, but we had a little bit of a pullback in the cutout that spilled into the cattle price space. So AMS called fed cattle here in Kansas on Friday at $240, betting down just a hair from the week before. AMS called the feeder cattle market here in Kansas lower on, as well noted in other cases, lower volume. Couple exact transactions of note. 56 head weighing 682 came in at 378. Larger lot of 237 head weighing 873 came in at 347. Again, those are Kansas transactions last week. And then a similar trend showed up on the board. When we look over to the CME contracts, the October live cattle contract is 230, down about $5 on the week. October feeder cattle at 346, down more like $13 on the week. And I think this is a broader pause and kind of a, I'll say some demand uncertainty maybe. So the box beef cutout was down $10 on choice this past week. So $400 on Friday, and it was $410 the Friday before. And select was $378, down about $7 from the Friday before. Time will tell if this is just a temporary pause or if it's a broader, right near-term peak, so to speak, was established a week ago. The supply fundamentals haven't changed. I think I've said this for 6 months. I don't really apologize for it because I think it's the case, is I think the majority of the movement is driven by demand updates. And there's a lot of broader economic watching of the Federal Reserve. Updates in the labor market kind of suggest the broader economy maybe wasn't quite as strong as we thought it was even just 60 days ago. That potentially rains on beef demand is the point. To be determined if this is a 1 week update or longer, but it's definitely worth watching.
Any really concern then for this pause?
Well, my concern would be if, in fact, the economy is weaker than we thought, and maybe even worse if we're on the front end of a stagflation situation. So, Shelby, you and I are both too young to have experienced extended stagflation, but some of our listeners a little more experienced might have some gray hairs when they hear that term, and they might remember, stagflation is when an economy is not growing and yet we have inflation. That's a terrible combo. It has happened before. I'm not pronouncing that's what we have. Please don't misunderstand. But some of the fears are maybe we have the recipe for that. And that's hard on lots of industries. And it would not be good for beef demand is the reason I'm interjecting it here. I obviously hope and pray that's not what we're on the front end of. But there's been some elevated inflation concerns last couple of months and some more recent concerns about just general economic strength that makes the Federal Reserve's challenge even more challenging because they're dual mandate. And I think that's all just putting some pause on what have been very hot markets in the cattle space for several weeks now.
And while we're looking at the cattle market, what are we seeing for feedlot returns?
Yeah, so over the weekend, I updated our latest feedlot returns. You can find these on our AgManager website. Quick reminder, and this is really important this time because the values are elevated, is this is presuming no hedging. So it's cash, cash, cash. You paid the cash price for feeders, you received the cash price for fed, and you basically bought the feed as you went at the cash price. And because of that, in an elevated cattle market, the numbers we're putting out are historically high. So if you pull up this, the most recent posting, for example, for September, we're projecting a positive return of $700 per steer and $579 per heifer. Well, what's underneath that is a notable increase in the sales price. So those animals leaving the yard relative to what they were expected to be when you made the feeder purchase. So had you made some hedging, you're not going to experience quite that large is the point. I will also interject, we do projections 9 months out. So the furthest out we're currently projecting are for cattle leaving the yard in May. But I'm interjecting this because by the time we get to February and March, much less May of 2026, we're actually projecting negative returns. And the biggest thing that's underneath that is much higher placement prices. So a steer that leaves the yard next May is projected to have come into the yard roughly 6 or 7 months earlier at a full $100 per hundredweight higher purchase price. I'm a little bit Dr. Bear on this. Is times are good right now if you're unhedged, fully recognize that, and that's great to talk about. But it looks like it could be short-lived given the notable increase and frankly an even higher increase in feeder cattle prices than fed cattle.
As always, wanting to mention the meat demand monitor, and what did we see for a willingness to pay?
Before I break down the August summary real quick, here's a shout out to the beef checkoff. So most of our listeners know this is a project based at K-State. Everything's fully available on our AgManager.info website that has a page dedicated to the MDM. And the beef and the pork checkoff have funded this now for over 6 years. The beef checkoff has recently, within the last 10 days, decided to renew that support for an additional 3 years. So here's a thank you for that kind of update for those that are watching the broader checkoff portfolio, and I give credence to who's funding this. Now, to your question, August is the most recent data that we have to speak to. So you can find the August base MDM report on our Ag Manager website. And I would say that was a really good demand update, specifically 7 of the 8 categories that we track. We have a retail, so grocery store for at-home consumption, and then we have a dinner meal food service, so like our away from home demand metric. 7 of the 8 proteins in both market channels had higher demand, higher willingness to pay values in August than July. I've been emphasizing the away from home part of that because there's been a lot of concern during 2025 about food service. To be determined if that was a late summer before you go back to school kind of vacation push. And to the extent people are on the road more than normal, then that's going to help food service demand because you weren't at home you're out of town that week. We'll see if that continues in the months ahead. I obviously hope it does. But the update for August was it was a really good demand month per that metric.
And when we're talking about the meat demand monitor, is this just looking at people from Kansas or across the United States?
So it's a nationally representative effort. Every month we're surveying over 3,000 U.S. residents, and we do it in a way where our numbers are, as I said, nationally representative based upon residents. So there's more from California, Texas than Kansas, to your point, because that's the population relative in our nation. Gender, income, ethnicity, age, and education. There's 6 specs there. So they're nationally representative statistics. You can go pull down quarterly data at the state level. That was not the original intent of this, but again, kind of at the request of the checkoff, we did that. Justin Bina, who's now at Arizona State, kind of helps and leads a dashboard, pulling the same data there. So you can get state level insights, but you can also get generational insights. So I made the comment about age, and we ended this month's base report with another generational update. Shelby, you might remember that each of these base reports, which there's a lot of purple on them, so that's good for everybody's soul, it have the protein values in them. So what we're asking these MDM survey respondents is here's a list of 12 things. What are the 4 most important in your protein purchasing decision? What are the 4 least? And of course, the 4 you don't pick are in the middle. And taste, freshness, price, and safety regularly are the top 4, or more narrowly, most frequently picked to be a top 4 item. And then conversely, things like environmental impact, animal welfare, origin traceability, use of hormones and antibiotics are the 4 that are most often in the bottom 4 bucket. And we summarize that every month. Those are kind of the relative ranks of importance. I highlight that for a couple of reasons. One is taste and freshness regularly carry the day. I've been using the phrase meat is having a moment here in 2025. I think the taste profile of meat is a big part of that. And it lines up with this protein values kind of relative point. But to my comment or my shout out about generations is we put out everything I just said every month, but we ended the August 2025 with another figure that broke that apart by generation. So baby boomers, Gen X, and then millennials, you'll find a fancy graph at the end of the August report where we summarize these protein values separately for those 3 generations. And what I would impress on our listeners here is the relative order. So taste and freshness are most important regardless of generation. Environmental impact, animal welfare, so forth, rank lower regardless of the generation. But the willingness to trade those things off, kind of how steep those trade-offs are, differs a fair amount by generation. And specifically, the younger generation, which is millennials here, those born between 81 and 96, are more willing to give up taste or price or some of those higher ranking things for some of those production practice claims, where conversely, the older generation, baby boomers, are much less likely to give up taste, freshness, price for those production practice claims like environmental impact. This has direct relevance for those that are, doing niche marketing, right? Who might have an interest in a claim that you're interested in producing. And I'm trying to make the point here, just on the case of age, not all U.S. residents are equal. This is just one component of that. There's a lot more to it than that. But we have a large, very diverse, by all terms of the meaning, diverse public, and we need to keep all that in mind.
Glynn, if people would like to hear you talk at other events other than Agriculture Today, where can they do that?
Yeah, so almost all our stuff is cross-linked from the Ag Manager website, and there's an events page there, which will give you kind of an update about some of those upcoming events. Two of them for my notes here, because they're going to occur here before the end of the month, is Stocker Field Day. So Dr. Balazzi and his team, quite a few of our listeners go to that. I encourage them to. I'm admittedly biased, but I do think it is a very unique and stands out event because there's not many stocker-focused events. And Dale and his team do a great job. Myself and Lance Zimmerman. Lance is with Rabobank, fellow K-State grad as well, and friend of mine. We're down to give a joint talk this year, so we're kind of kicking off the session. Some of what I'm talking about here and a lot more about, herd expansion and things for the stocker segment is what we're going to be spending our time talking about. And then right after that is the Ag Lenders Conference, which is, again, several of us out of the Ag Econ department, first in Garden City at the end of September, and then the first day of October here in Manhattan, where we engage with the ag lending community. And there's, of course, quite a few questions about these elevated cattle prices that lenders have an interest in. So depending on what kind of hat you're wearing when you listen to this, those are a couple upcoming opportunities.
Glynn, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on, Shelby.
That was K-State livestock economist Glynn Tonsor. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing a recent publication titled Using Atrazine Wisely with K-State Weed Specialist Sarah Lancaster, K-State Watershed Specialist Ron Graber, and K-State Extension Specialist for Environmental Quality Peter Tomlinson. Sarah, Ron, Peter, I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
Sarah, why is atrazine something people choose to use?
So a lot of times when I talk about atrazine, Shelby, I refer to it sort of as the foundation of our weed management programs in corn and sorghum in particular. It provides control of a variety of weed species. It has both pre-emergence activity and post-emergence activity on weeds. And it also has some synergistic properties with other herbicides. So even though over recent decades we've seen total use rates per acre of atrazine decreasing, we still know that we need a certain amount of atrazine in our weed management programs. A lot of times you'll hear extension specialists say things like atrazine just makes the programs look better. And it really does. It really is still a key component of our weed management programs.
Have we seen the label for atrazine change over the years?
So again, this goes back multiple decades, Shelby. The use rates we have on the current labels have been in place since the 90s. But right now, there's a lot of conversation around the next kind of iteration of the atrazine label. And so we're potentially looking at, maybe some additional use restrictions on that total rate per acre. But those use restrictions are going to be more specific into watersheds and geographies and soil types and things of that nature. So there will be some folks who can continue kind of business as usual right now, with the exception of anything that is related to the EPA mandated changes on the label, but there will be other places that do see some additional restrictions.
And you mentioned EPA, Sarah. And so, Peter, why are we talking about using atrazine wisely?
Yeah. So Shelby, EPA, when they think about atrazine, one of the metrics that they're looking at is what's the concentration of atrazine in water. So this particularly has to do with drinking water. And so in Kansas, many of our lakes and reservoirs are drinking water sources. We also have a lot of well water. And so EPA looks at what is the maximum contaminant level, or MCL, and they're going to look at both an acute, which is what's that single exposure. And for acute, it's 170 parts per billion. They're also going to look at a chronic exposure level. And so they've set that at 3 parts per billion, and anything 3 parts per billion and above over a 70-year lifespan, that's the threshold at which they anticipate a human health effect. So, in terms of drinking water, we need to, on a day-to-day basis, stay below that 3 parts per billion and minimize any spikes, single day events that exceed 170 parts per billion.
Are there drinking water concerns for wildlife or livestock and not just humans?
Certainly there are metrics that are used for the potential for a fish kill. I'm not aware. EPA certainly doesn't, correct me if I'm wrong, Sarah, livestock, they don't look at.
No, most of the when a company submits their data package to get a new herbicide label, they will submit animal studies. Sometimes those animal studies are to support the human data, and sometimes those animal studies are really more based on like aquatic invertebrates. That seems to be aquatic systems is a big piece of that, because that's kind of the base of the ecosystem. And so they really spend a lot of time focusing on that, is to estimate what's going to happen further up the food chain.
The EPA does look at the concentration of a given chemical in the tissue of aquatic species, and then we'll look at how, as those aquatic species are consumed, how does that product bioaccumulate as we move up in the food chain.
Ron, why do you see it important to use atrazine wisely?
Well, in my part of the state, in the south central part of Kansas, atrazine, specifically in the Little Ark watershed, we have streams and stream segments that are impaired with atrazine, which means that we've exceeded some of those numbers that Peter just talked about. And more specifically, the Little Ark River is a drinking water source for the city of Wichita. They attempt to capture water out of the river when the flows are adequate, and then put that in the underground aquifer for later use. And so when they do that, that water has to meet the drinking water standard that Peter just mentioned, the 3 parts per billion. If that water in the river exceeds that, then they have two options. They can either treat the water to prevent it, or to bring it down to the 3, or just simply not capture those flows. And so the city has invested millions of dollars in infrastructure to try to capture that water. And so when the flow is adequate, they certainly want to be able to do that. And so we as a watershed group, watershed restoration protection strategy, partnered up with the city of Wichita 20 years ago to work together to try to minimize or at least reduce the risk of those spikes that Peter mentioned in the river, so that when we do have adequate flow, they can capture that water.
And so while we're thinking about watersheds, what do you see as some really important management practices for producers or people using atrazine?
Well, there's a number of practices that are in kind of a suite, and as we implement the program and educate farmers, growers about how to use atrazine a little differently, we talk to them about these practices and try to find a practice that might fit in their management system, because everybody farms a little bit differently. Their systems are a little different, and so we've been able to have some flexibility to talk about different practices with different growers. And keep in mind, we're talking about corn growers and grain sorghum growers. That's where the atrazine use is at. And so in that 20-year history of working with farmers, we've we've been able to be flexible enough that as growing conditions, economic conditions change, we usually can find something that will fit that will help reduce the risk and really minimize the possibility of having those spikes. And so things like reducing the atrazine rate, and maybe not using that full labeled rate, but use a little bit less and be able to put that in a mix with some other chemicals and get really good weed control. In some cases, a producer will use atrazine at a little bit earlier time of the year. So, instead of putting that atrazine on right at planting time, they may come in a couple of months earlier at a time where we typically don't get the big runoff events. And so, if we can get a quarter-inch or a half-inch rainfall event that we move the chemical into the soil, then the opportunity to lose it is reduced dramatically, as opposed to maybe putting that on in the middle of April where we might see a 2-inch rainfall event and, it all leaves the field. And and if that happens, not only have we put atrazine in the stream, but we're not getting any weed control either. And so that's a couple of practices. Sometimes guys will come in and do like a post plant, which would be after the crop is actually up, and that will help hold it in place as well. So, that's been some of the more popular practices that we've incentivized. Certainly there's some other ones that are in the toolbox as well, but those are the ones that are kind of the most popular. I would tell you at one time when Roundup Ready corn hit the scene, we really saw a decrease in use of atrazine, and in that case, guys weren't using any atrazine, and then came along our friend the pigweed and became Roundup resistant, and all of a sudden we had to go back to using atrazine when maybe we didn't have to for a while. So, again, that's part of the flexibility that we've been able to, kind of change as conditions change.
That was K-State Watershed Specialist Ron Graber, and he was joined by K-State Weed Specialist Sarah Lancaster and K-State Extension Specialist for Environmental Quality Peter Tomlinson. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but when we come back, we'll once again be joined by Ron, Sarah, and Peter as they continue discussing using atrazine wisely. If you aren't going to be able to hear the end of today's show on Agriculture Today, you can always find it on agtoday.net or by searching for Agriculture Today on your favorite podcast platform. We're now cutting to that short break, but we'll be right back. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with K-State's Peter Tomlinson, Sarah Lancaster, and Ron Graber. Peter, as we're talking about different management options, are there other things producers might want to consider?
Yes. In addition to what Ron has talked about, we also have a suite of structural conservation practices. And so, these would be thinking about how we move water on the landscape and how we slow that water down and give it time to infiltrate into the soil. So, in this, we can change our tillage to, go to moving from, full tillage to reduced or no till. But we also have things like terraces and making sure that terraces are maintained and able to handle current storm events. Those structures, while originally put in place for erosion control, have been found to be an important tool from the, managing how water moves across the landscape and giving it time to infiltrate into the soil. And then as we move out of the field, grassed waterways, vegetative filter strips, riparian buffer areas, anything that's going to slow down that water, capture sediment, capture the herbicide, helps to keep it out of our streams and lakes.
What are those key points then you really want producers to take home when they're thinking about going ahead and putting atrazine on their field?
I think from my perspective, Shelby, one of the things that I like to remind folks about is that, yes, a lot of these, restrictions, requirements, recommendations are driven from an environmental perspective. But if I'm spending my dollars, my input dollars on atrazine to control my weeds, I want it in my field to control my weeds. So this is a win-win in order to kind of both keep the environmental side of things happy, but also improve our weed management practices.
I think another thing that one of the things that we talked to farmers about early on when we started our program 20 years ago is, we could lose atrazine. And atrazine's been around for a long time. It's generally been pretty cheap and pretty effective. And, if we lose atrazine, then as Peter said, that's a tool that is gone. And if it goes away, we won't get it back. And so, I think it makes a lot of sense to pay attention to how we use atrazine and really try to, as Sarah said, keep it in the field so we get weed control, but also keep it out of our drinking water sources.
And I'd say that the takeaway from the best management practices are, reduce the amount of atrazine on the soil surface at any one time, especially during those periods of high runoff potential events, large thunderstorms. Reduce the effect of the first runoff event on atrazine loss so that we're keeping that product in the field and able to work on the targeted weeds, and then provide a mechanism for deposition of the atrazine to prevent it from leaving the field. And so we've got those three summary points as kind of the lead-off introduction to the best management practices.
If people would like to read more on this topic, how can they do that?
So, Shelby, we just kind of polished off an extension publication called Using Atrazine Wisely. So that's one place folks can go. Every time I think I talk to you, I remind folks that there is information in the Chemical Weed Control Guide for field crops. And so there's some information not only about weed management with atrazine, but we do also have a summary page in the weed guide about using atrazine wisely. So there's kind of two reasons to go look at the weed guide.
Sarah, Peter, Ron, I appreciate you all taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Thank you, Shelby.
That was K-State Weed Specialist Sarah Lancaster, K-State Watershed Specialist Ron Graber, and K-State Extension Specialist for Environmental Quality Peter Tomlinson. I will link the resources that were mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.